Hello, everyone. This is the 165th episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. For this episode, I interview Dr. Peter J. Watson, a British lecturer in the Department of Spanish, Portuguese, and Latin American Studies at the University of Leeds. We continue our interview series with Mr. Watson as we discuss Colombian football history, this time from 1962 to the 1994 World Cup. Dr. Watson is the author of Football and Nation Building in Colombia from 2010 to 2018, the only thing that unites us. Welcome back, Peter.
Hi, Shahan. Thanks very much for the invitation to come back on the show.
Thank you. Let's go back in time. Last time we left off at the 1962 World Cup. What was the state of Colombian football post 1962 World Cup era as we entered the 1970s?
Okay, so the first thing that's worth saying is that 1962 was somewhat of a surprise. Colombia suddenly hasn't become one of the stronger South American footballing nations. It's a bit of a surprise result that got them there. They did surprisingly well with the draw at Soviet Union. So we don't actually have a particularly strong national setup in most ways. The league itself has stabilized to some extent. Listeners may remember that at the end of the El Dorado, there is somewhat of an economic collapse with various teams leaving the league. There is still an economic fragility about the Colombian Football League. There are still various accusations of improvisation, short-termism, poor management from clubs, but also the league structures themselves. We do have teams from various major football cities like Union Magdalena and Junior from Barranquilla leaving the league and then joining again. Real Cartagena and a team called Oro Negro appeared very briefly. Oro Negro only for a year.
When you
Again,
say they left the league, what does that mean?
they basically left the league. They weren't sustainable, so they actually left the league. Their franchise kind of ends. They leave the Di Mayor. So in the case of Oro Negro, they actually replaced Deportivo Independiente Medellin in that particular year. And in the following year, they played 1 year in the league, then Medellin returned. And Oro Negro basically ceased to exist as a professional football club. Real Cartagena is actually worse because they left the league. They weren't sustainable right in the middle of the 1972 league itself. And then their space is occupied by Atletico Bucaramanga. So we have this kind of sense of teams being economically unstable, of directors maybe taking over the team, hoping it'd be profitable, but not being able to make the profits to run the teams. So that's one of the major problems. Some of the teams are doing a bit better. Millonarios are still doing rather well. Atlético Nacional generally, for example, are building a relatively solid tradition, often with just using Colombian players. But we do see, lesser Brazilians, Uruguayans, Argentinians joining the league for a short period of time, bringing some luster. Actually, Garrincha joins Junior de Barranquilla in 1968, for example. But there are lots of worries about the league system. There's actually a kind of a study carried out in 1967 by the Paraguayan coach Cesar Lopez Fretes to analyze what the state of Colombian football is. And there's a kind of a short-lived plan of the Sardi Carbonell plan to say that hopefully in 5 years' time, every Colombian team should have 11 native players. We've had this long period of El Dorado with lots of players coming in, and therefore the Colombian football players not developing. And they still see this as being a problem. Nothing happens with that. Atletico Nacional and a couple of others are the only teams that occasionally do that. But the needs to try and get more money into the league mean that they are trying to buy foreign players in. Quarentinha is another one, for example, a fairly decent Brazilian player. The other things that are kind of happening is that they are trying to bring luster to national football by bringing over teams from Europe and South America for these kind of exhibition matches. In 1967, for example, we have Dinamo Moscow, we have Napoli, Benfica, the great team of Eusebio, come across to Colombia to play. Actually, Omar Sivori, one of the great Argentinian players, his career's ended in a match where he was playing for Napoli against Deportivo Cali. Santos, obviously, are on tour with Pele for most of this time. They play in Colombia as well. There's actually a very famous occasion where a referee called Guillermo El Chato, the dullard Velasquez, sends Pele off in one game against Millonarios. But then after 20 minutes of arguments, Pele is on the pitch again. This is the kind of thing, but again, Then we look at players. None of the players really make the most of that exposure that 1962 gives them. None of them, for example, are going to Europe. The only one that was invited was Delio El Maravilla Gamboa, the Marvel Gamboa, who apparently is invited to play in Spain or Italy by Renato Cesarini. But he is worried. He doesn't think the level is suitable to him. He's worried about the extra professionalism. And he is one of the more professional players in Colombia. So that's a problem as well. No one is benefiting. No one is going to Europe. And then if we look at the international kind of scale of things in terms of the national team, it's a series of failures. The 1963 South American Championship is held in Bolivia. Always a tricky place to go, but Colombia come last. They only draw one game. They lose to Bolivia. They lose to Ecuador, which is the two teams you might expect to have a good chance to win. Argentina beat them, Brazil beat them, Paraguay beat them. And to make it even worse than coming last, four of their players are suspended for poor behaviour by the Colombian Football Federation for 3 years and 2 years. And they were players that had been quite successful at the World Cup. So there is an immediate decay. 1966, the World Cup qualifying, they have what looks in it a quite achievable group. They're playing Ecuador and they're playing Chile, but they lose both games against Ecuador. Chile beat them 7-2, and then the win that they get against Chile in the last game is irrelevant. So that's a failure. 1967 South American Championship, they don't actually get into the final stages. They have to play a playoff against Chile, which they lose because it's only a kind of a six-team tournament that year. 1970, again, they're in a group with Brazil and Paraguay. Again, Colombia never beat Brazil. For this period, beating Brazil is impossible. So that goes as well. And then 1974, which is probably the best chance they have, they're playing against Ecuador again and Uruguay. Again, this is not one of the best Uruguay teams. And actually, Colombia does manage to beat Uruguay, which is one of those most famous wins Colombia have in the 70s. But unfortunately, Uruguay qualify on away goals. So really, we have a fairly unstable and unsuccessful league that is kind of relying on foreign players to bring luster. We don't really have a great generation of Colombian players, and on the national level, we have a series of failures in pretty much every competition they participate in.
And I imagine it must have been the same as far as their performances in the Copa Libertadores in this era.
Yeah, exactly the same. I mean, there has been a good start. The first tournament is in 1960. In 1960 and 1961, if you look at the records, it says that Millonarios and Santa Fe both get to the semi-finals, which seems good on the face of it. But then you look at how they actually had to get there. Basically, Millonarios only had to play Lau, the Universidad de Chile, in the first round. They do beat them 6-0 away, which is a fantastic result. Then they win 1-0, but then they're in the semi-final and they lose to Olimpia de Paraguay. For Santa Fe in 61, they have to beat Barcelona from Ecuador. Again, a solid team, but not a great one. Then they beat Jorge Wilson, a Bolivian team, so again, not a particularly strong team. They only win on lots. This is the occasion where there are no away goals and they have to draw lots to decide who goes through. And then the semi-finals against Palmeiras. Then we have a period of literally failure for a decade where no team is getting really beyond the group stage, apart from Deportivo Cali, who gets to the quarterfinals in 1969. And in the 73 and 74, Millonarios again gets the semi-final, but this is really effectively a second group. Millonarios have to just beat Deportivo Cali in the first round, then they're bottom of the semi-final group, which is three teams. So they've only won one game, or they've only beaten one opponent. It's the same in 1974. And Millonarios just have to beat Venezuelan teams, who are even worse than Colombian teams. And then in the semi-final group, they're second behind Sao Paulo, although they do better than Defensor Lima. So again, Colombian teams, if they come up against maybe a Venezuelan team or maybe an Ecuadorian team in a group phase, maybe they have a chance of getting through. But generally, the way these things are set up is that they're probably playing against an Argentinian team, a Uruguayan team, a Brazilian team. And as soon as that happens, Colombia doesn't have a chance. They're seen as being in the same category as those very weakest teams in the continent. And there's often that kind of slanting of the tournament in those particular years to help the bigger clubs go through.
The significant success of Colombian football in the 1970s was the 1975 Copa America, where they finished as runner-up to Peru. Can you discuss this rare success at international level?
Yeah, so this really comes out of the blue. It's important to remember that this is the first tournament that is called the Copa America. Previously, it's been the South American Championship. It's also the first time it's been held in 8 years. There have been various problems between the various federations. It's actually a very good sporting year for Colombia in general. There are two boxers, Kid Pambele, Antonio Cervantes, and Rocky Valdez have both done well in boxing championships. So there is a kind of a new buzz maybe about Colombian sport. And this particular Copa America team increases that. And one of the reasons why is that there is a lot more preparation. This is not a tournament that is held in one place. This is played over a series of kind of matches. There are group stages and then a kind of knockout semi-final and final. And so it's not all in one place. Colombia actually has about a 6 month concentración where they're training the team up, then they're training the team up. And the manager at this time is Efrain El Caiman Sanchez, who has been associated with kind of lots of Colombia's greatest moments. He is a goalkeeper in the 1947 and 1948 Copa Americas and is the first Colombian to play in Argentina as a goalkeeper for San Lorenzo. He's one of the main Colombian stars of the El Dorado period, and he's also there for the 1962 World Cup draw against Soviet Union. So it's kind of appropriate that as a manager, he brings this partial success. It's not a great Colombian team in many ways. The two players, or the three players really, that stand out are the goalkeeper, Pedro Zappe, who for a long time was seen as the best Colombian goalkeeper. Certainly in the whole of the 70s and 80s, he kind of is eventually succeeded by Higuita. They have Willington Ortiz, who I know we're going to talk about later on, a brilliant kind of winger forward. And then there's a guy called Jairo Arboleda, who is this kind of mercurial genius passing playmaker who is really one of those typical number 10s that South American football produces. And again, he is very unreliable. He is an enjoyer of the nightlife, let's say. So he doesn't really have the career that he should. But this is one of the tournaments when he does. But what they do have is a lot of hard-working players. Diego Mania, who has a fantastic afro, one of the great afros of world football in the 70s, is a very solid midfield player. Miguel Escobar, again, is a perfectly good centre back. And Ernesto Diaz is a forward who will actually be signed by Standard Liège in Belgium after this tournament. Doesn't do particularly well, but at least they have these players who are starting to have some sense of trajectory on a South American level. The other kind of feature of this particular time in Colombian football is that there is a kind of a process of nationalization going on. You know, they're looking to occasionally nationalize players who were born in Uruguay, in Argentina, so they can play in Colombia to enhance the squad. There are a couple in this particular team. Hugo Londero is a kind of an Argentinian player who had played for Gimnasia and Esgrima, but had a long career in Colombia and eventually gets nationalized. And he ends up being the fourth highest scorer in Colombian league history. So he's in this squad as well. There's also Nelson Silva Pacheco, who is a Uruguayan who'd played in Danubio and Liverpool. So Colombia are kind of making the most of the resources available to them, let's say, by training properly, by being very organized, but also by using this nationalization process. The other thing that's very famous about this squad, apart from doing well, is that they're wearing this pretty hideous kind of orangey pink kit, which is supposedly a homage to the kind of Netherlands team of the 70s. It has nothing to do with the Colombian flag. The team are often known as the Zapote Mecánico. Zapote is the color that this shirt is supposed to be. So that they certainly stand out with that kit and black shorts. The group that they're in to start with is against Paraguay and Ecuador, and they do very well. They win all of the games. The most interesting game is the Paraguay game away, where they're playing in Asunción. This is under the General Stroessner dictatorship. So this is a particularly unpleasant time of Paraguayan politics. And Paraguay have a very rugged team. This is a team that are known to play extremely physically, to put in the boot if they need to. A lot of people talk about the Garra Chorua when we're talking about Uruguay, but Paraguay also have this kind of Garra Guarani, this kind of hard, tough, uncompromising attitude. And this is really shown after 43 minutes when Ernesto Diaz scores a goal and then makes the mistake of kind of taking the mick out of the Paraguayan goalkeeper, Ever Almeida, who then starts chasing him to try and hit him or whatever. And the Paraguayan police take this as the opportunity to invade the pitch and start beating up the Colombian players and some of the coaches as well. And this is on TV, so the Colombians are also seeing this happen. Unfortunately, I can't find any footage of this. This is one of those videos I've looked for a lot, but I can't find any. But actually, the game is called off after 43 minutes. The CONMEBOL award the game to Colombia. And so Colombia progressed to the semi-final. And this is a real success. I mean, Paraguay are a solid team, but not a great one. But Colombia then beat Uruguay. So this is becoming a little bit of a habit following the 74 World Cup group as well. They beat Uruguay at home 3-0 and then lose 1-0 away. And that game itself, when they're playing Uruguay, is established a kind of a legend of Chilean referees being very biased against Colombians because, again, there are a lot of players that are injured. The Uruguayan team are playing extremely physically. Some of the best Colombian players, Willington Ortiz, Ernesto Diaz, and Soto, are all injured in the game. And actually, it means that they are, in most cases, not fit enough to play in the final games as they were needed. The goalkeeper also has his collarbone dislocated after he saves a penalty. So this is a really tough game. And even if they lose 1-0, the president, Alfonso Lopez Mitchison of Colombia, actually receives them with a hero's welcome. He goes to the airport and receives them because everyone's kind of seen what type of game this was. And they meet Peru in the final. Peru, this is a great Peruvian team. This is the team of Teófilo Cubillas, of Oblitas, of Chumpitas, of Cholo Sotil. But Colombia have a bit of a chance because two of those players, Cubillas and Sotil, have not been allowed to travel to South America by their clubs in Europe. So Colombia feel they have a chance. The problem is, though, is that Diaz is only fit enough to come on as a substitute. Ortiz is struggling for fitness and can't play. But they win the first game at home, they lose the second game away. So we have this decider in a neutral venue. Unfortunately, at this point, Cholo Sotil and Cubillas are back. Peru are certainly the best team, and they eventually win the neutral game, which is played in Venezuela. Again, away goals is not a thing in South American football at this time. But even so, this is a really important team in Colombia. We have one of the first moments where the team becomes stars. They are in the newspapers, they're on the TV. Umania with his afro has become a kind of a fashion icon. There are players that have these great sideburns again who are being copied by people across the country. So we see for the first time these players not only succeeding but also becoming stars as well. And I think again what's important is that we have players from across the country. We have people like Willington Ortiz is from the Pacific coast. We have guys from Antioquia in the kind of middle of the country. We have people from the Caribbean. So it feels like a very representative Colombian team with Afro-Colombians as part of that setup. So it was a very strong team, maybe not in the case of stars, but a team that came together as a team for the nation and achieved a great deal of success.
And you already named him, the Millonario striker Willington Ortiz. What was his status in the world game at this point?
I think Willington Ortiz is one of those players who people don't know, but he's probably one of the best players one of those people who comes into the category of best players to never play in a World Cup, with George Best and that kind of category of player. He's frequently seen as one of the best Colombian players ever. Obviously, with the way in which history tends to work, most people immediately think of James Rodriguez, of Valderrama, of Asprilla, for example. But Willington Ortiz is almost certainly in that category. And he did it in a time where he did not have the quality of players around him to build on. He was almost a one-man team in lots of ways with lots of kind of solid, fairly hard-working players around him. So to give you an idea, he is a dribbler. He is a very speedy, very fast winger, stroke forward. He has fantastic ball control. He's a great crosser of the ball, extremely hard-working, very humble, extremely professional. He has to work hard to make it in the game in the first place. He comes from a very poor area of the Pacific coast called Tumaco, which in more recent years has become a real problem area in terms of violence and drug trafficking. He has various trials at clubs and eventually makes it at Millonarios. This is a very solid Millonarios team. It's coached by Gabriel Ochoa Uribe, one of the great Colombian managers of all time, a very pragmatic, very organized coach. And he emerges with a goal scored in a friendly game against Internacional of Brazil. There is one of these exhibition games, the great Internacional side from Porto Alegre are playing, and Ortiz comes on and scores a goal, and this immediately catapults him into the public awareness. And he is really seen as the one Colombian player in the 70s who is of an international standard, who can compete with the very best players of the continent really in this time. People as good as, for example, Riccardo Boccini, the great Argentinian player for Independiente, told him that or said that when Willington Ortiz retired, that the Colombian football was really going to miss him, and he wasn't sure that anyone could even replace him. His qualities were incomparable. And Bilardo, who managed him at the end of Ortiz's career for the national team, said that he was incredibly important for Colombian football. He was kind of like the Maradona, the same presence that Maradona had for Argentina. That was Willington Ortiz. His technical qualities were unsubstitutable. He knew how to do everything. He was incredibly modest. He was the star. He is basically Millonarios' greatest ever player in terms of a Colombian. Obviously, he can't possibly compete with the likes of Pedernera and Di Stefano, but in terms of Colombian players, Willington Ortiz is the Millonarios idol. He also does play for Deportivo Cali and then for America de Cali at the tail end of his career. Again, the America team that he plays for is probably the best club team he plays for. He has a chance at winning the Copa Libertadores, although unfortunately they fall short. But it's worth bearing in mind that when the IFFHS, which is one of these football kind of historical statistical bodies that like to do these ranking systems, that he was seen as being the best Colombian player of the 20th century by that institution, ahead of Valderrama, ahead of Asprilla, ahead of Freddy Rincon. That's the level we're talking about with Willington Ortiz. And it was very sad that he didn't get the chance to play, in a World Cup. And it's possibly a shame that he never took the opportunities he had to go and play in Europe either. That's the one thing the reason why he's really not known and doesn't get the credit that he probably deserves.
In this period of 1970s going into the early 1980s, we also have the future national team manager, Francisco Pachu Maturana, playing for Atlético Nacional. What can you say about his place in Colombian football history at this point?
So at this point, I don't think people would have realized that he would gain the importance that he would. He is a solid defender for Atlético Nacional. He does play for Bucaramanga and Deportes Tolima at the end of his career. But we're not looking at a great player by any means. We're looking at a good leader, though. We're looking at a very proficient, intelligent, sensible, mature Colombian footballer. Very typical of the stereotype of Antioquia. There is always this stereotype of the hardworking, organized, more professional Colombian. Maturana, again, is a person that has made it from potential poverty, or at least potential difficulty. He is born in a place called Quibdó, which is in Chocó. And Chocó is another of Colombia's most poor regions. It's on the Pacific coastline, quite underdeveloped, very well known for being where a lot of Afro-Colombians and indigenous Colombians are. Again, in more recent years, it has accrued a very dangerous reputation as a place. But actually, his family moved from Chocó to Medellin quite early in his life. One of the things that's most important about Maturana really is that he wasn't just a footballer, he was a dentist as well. He went to the Antioquia University, he studied dentistry there, and he practiced as a professional dentist as well. So I suppose that what you have that may have indicated the trajectory he might have is intelligence, is leadership, is organization, is making the most of the talent that he had. He did win the league twice with Nacional in 73 and 76. He did play 6 times for Colombia, mostly towards the end of his career in the 1982 World Cup qualifying. So maybe Bilardo, who was the manager at the time, spotted those kind of leadership, organizational characteristics in him. But I don't think anyone would have known that he would be, again, arguably Colombia's greatest tactical manager from Colombia. And I think it's worth bearing in mind as well. I was trying to think about this, whether there's been a better black manager in the history of the game. There aren't very many of them that have succeeded on international level. And even if Maturana, his 2 World Cups, or his World Cups for Colombia, don't go as well as they want, he does raise a team. He does raise a generation. He creates an identity. And I think that often is important to state that it's difficult to be a black manager in any type of football, whichever country you're in. So that again is something that we need to state. I think the other thing that again, one of the criticisms in Colombia that he eventually had was of the rosca paisa, which is this kind of favoritism of the players in Antioquia. Certainly, some of his national teams featured a lot of players from Nacional. There's this kind of joke of the Selección Nacional de Colombia, the national team of Colombia is the Nacional club team. from Medellin. That's not fully true, but there was certainly a lot of this idea of bias. And again, he was very well known for being a man of Antioquia.
You mentioned him as well, the future national team manager of Argentina, Carlos Bilardo. He managed the Colombian national team in the early 1980s, I believe for the 1982 World Cup qualifiers. What was his impact, if any at all?
I think you could argue that his most important impact for Colombian football is for Deportivo Cali. He takes them from being a solid club team to being a very successful one in Colombia, but also in the continent. Deportivo Cali under Carlos Bilardo are the first Colombian team to get to a Libertadores final. They actually got to the semi-final the previous year. I think it's in 78 and 79, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Unfortunately, they meet Boca Juniors in both the semi-final in the previous year, and then in 79 they lose to Boca Juniors again. And this is a great Boca Junior team. It's coached by Toto Lorenzo. It's one of those great Boca generations that Boca fans will potentially point to and say, yeah, that was our best team. But they've had a very good run. If you look at the type of teams they're beating, they beat Peñarol, the great Uruguayan side. They beat Cerro Porteño, one of the very tough Paraguayan teams who are a strong team in that generation. So Bilardo is having a very important impact. For the national team, unfortunately, it's a very poor generation. You look at the players he have. Again, Zappe is coming towards the end of his career as a goalkeeper. Willington Ortiz is in his peak, but really there is very little else. Hernan Herrera is a decent goal scorer, but there is not really a strong team. So if you look at Bilardo's record, he only wins one match of the 10 that they play. They draw four and they lose five. In actual fact, he nearly committed suicide, apparently, in Lima when Colombia lost 2-0. And that was really the end of their qualifying hopes. And apparently, he was only stopped from jumping off a balcony by the physical trainer, Ricardo
Oh,
Echeverria.
wow. Is that
So,
true?
yeah. So apparently it's true. That's one of the things that he has said in an interview, apparently. I found it in several sources when I was doing the research for this podcast. What he also says, though, is that he learned a lot. He learned a lot from making the most out of players. He learned a lot about ensuring that people were training well, professionalizing, creating good team units. I think it's also worth bearing in mind that Bilardo is a product of the kind of the anti-football estudiantes teams as well. So there are some scandals, in Colombian football of him spying on other teams, of these kind of things. He's also someone that used a lot of video playback to analyze things. Another thing apparently he did was he thought green was an unlucky color. Deportivo Cali play in green, so apparently they played more in white than green in the years that Bilardo was there. So I think that in terms of the Colombian players, there is a lot of criticism. The media criticize them a lot for being very rigorous, for being overly meticulous in training. And apparently Colombia, for some reason, didn't see this as a good process. Again, there's a kind of a history of Colombian footballers for a long time not being seen as the most professional in South America. That's certainly been a characteristic of Colombians, unfortunately. I mean, Maturana is one of the ones who was. Certainly Ortiz is another, but there are lots of stories of players who weren't professional enough and probably wouldn't have gone to South America because they weren't professional enough in terms of their behavior. So maybe that says a lot. So unfortunately, Bilardo, his time for the national team anyway is not one of success, but at club level, he does, take a Colombian team to the Copa Libertadores final for the first time. And that's incredibly successful given the resources for a team like Deportivo Cali at the time.
Colombia were, in fact, originally chosen to be the hosts of the 1986 World Cup. Can you discuss why this fell through and eventually Mexico became the
Yeah.
hosts?
So this is basically originally awarded to Colombia in the 70s. There is a kind of process of taking turns between CONMEBOL and UEFA at this time. There's no concept of anyone in Asia or Africa hosting the World Cup. So really, we're basically going from Europe to South America and so on. So basically, if you think about it, Uruguay have already hosted it. Brazil have already hosted it. Chile have hosted it, quite surprisingly. Argentina have been appointed to host it in 1978. This is pre the coup when they're given it, pre the junta. So that feels okay. It seems to be almost late that Argentina haven't hosted it. Mexico have obviously hosted it as well. So the next team, if we're looking at South America, well, the next country are possibly Colombia, possibly Peru, possibly Ecuador, certainly not Venezuela. So Colombia, almost get it by default in a kind of a weird way. The figure that is behind the push to host it is a figure that is already very famous as a director, as a visionary in Colombian football, Alfonso Senio, who listeners may remember was one of the major figures behind the El Dorado period. He is the guy that is a director of the Millonarios team. He has a lot to do with the setting up of the El Dorado Di Mayor League, the new professional league in the first place. He is the one that suggests that they go and try and sign the Argentinian players like Pedernera when the strike is going on. So he is one of the great directors and organizers of Colombian football. And with the support of the president, Misael Pastrana, Colombia wins the hosting rights in 1974. The problem then comes is that Colombia does very little in terms of building the infrastructure to actually host it successfully. It's also worth pointing out that Colombia is not a wealthy country. They do not have a strong kind of national transport infrastructure, particularly at the time. We are also starting to get the problems of internal security. The FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, are becoming a growing threat. There is also the ELN, the National Liberation Army, another guerrilla organization, are becoming more prevalent. The M19, another type of guerrilla organization, is also becoming prevalent. We also start to have the problems of drug smuggling, of narco trafficking, first of more marijuana from the kind of Caribbean coast, but also then increasingly cocaine later on. So Colombia is starting to have security problems. It's not doing particularly well economically, and the government that follows the Pastrana government does very little to support the building infrastructure. There are kind of committees created, but they're not meeting, they're not doing much. The so-called sponsors are not doing much. In fact, the only thing that they really seem to have achieved is developed a mascot, which is a particularly ugly one compared to the Mexico one that I certainly remember in 1986 that became, one of those
Oh yeah,
famous
PK.
absolutely, the kind of
Yeah.
sombrero and everything, that was one of those famous mascots. It's worth, your listeners kind of looking up who the Colombian mascot was going to be. I don't think it would have had the same impact. So eventually FIFA get very worried. And there are two worries really. One is certainly the security aspect, but the infrastructure is another main thing. And there is a visit to Colombia and various demands are made. And the kind of demands that they're making is that Colombia has 12 stadiums with a minimum capacity of 40,000 people, four stadiums that should have a minimum capacity of 60,000, and two stadiums which should have at least 80,000. And those would be for the inaugural match and the final match. They're also demanding things like freezing of hotel rates for FIFA members, a fleet of limousines for FIFA officials. Again, these are the kind of things that Infantino still likes now, although probably not just a fleet, but airplanes as well. They're demanding a network of trains. Again, if you know Colombia, there is not a national railway service. This we're talking about jungles, plains, mountains. So this is unrealistic. They're demanding a network of roads that allowed the movement of fans. Now, those do exist, but again, traveling Colombia is very timely. So it's worth going back to those stadiums. If we talk about at the moment, there is only one stadium in Colombia that has capacity of over 50,000, and they were hoping for two in 1982 that would have over 80,000. So they still haven't managed this. They do have five stadiums that are over 40,000. But this gives you an idea of where things are now. They wouldn't be able to do what FIFA demanded in 1986 for now. So essentially, in 1982, things kind of come to a head, and Belisario Betancourt, who was the president at the time, in a very famous statement, renounces on the TV renounces the Colombian hosting rights, basically saying that as we are looking after public goods and the economy, as we know that squandering money is unforgivable, we won't host the World Cup in 1986 because basically the golden rule is not being fulfilled. That the World Cup should serve Colombia, it should benefit Colombia, and Colombia is not supposed to be benefiting the multinationals of FIFA and other organizations. Here we have other things to do. Okay, and that effectively is their statement. So Colombia becomes the only country thus far to have given up the hosting rights in 1982. And as we know, eventually Mexico will take it over and host in 1986.
Is it around this time in history where you have the narco dollars kind of entering the game?
Yeah, that's right. So We have this in really the kind of probably the late 70s, maybe the mid 70s. It's slightly difficult to know. What we essentially have is the reasons why this happens is we have fragile infrastructure, not just in football, but in general institutions generally. We have economic fragility. We have very little oversight from government of what's going on. So there are temptations. There are needs for money to come in from somewhere. So football becomes a very good way of laundering money. It becomes a very good way of the nouveau riche to acquire social status by joining the boards of particular clubs. Again, I think that most people tend to know the stories of Escobar and the Cali cartel and Rodriguez Gacha and think that most of the money is cocaine money from the 1980s and into the 1990s. It probably starts before that, actually, with there is a kind of a marijuana boom. It's known as the marimbera boom of the Caribbean coast. And it's probably likely that the first clubs that might have drug money going into them are Union Magdalena, which is a club from Santa Marta. Their particular director, Eduardo Davila Armenta, has a very notorious record. He's been in jail for drug trafficking. He's also been accused of having his first wife murdered. He still has some links with Union Magdalena in the present day, which is remarkable. But it's very likely that drug money is going to Magdalena in those years. It's possible as well that Junior de Barranquilla might have had the same problem. There are accusations of Fuad Char. There is a kind of a very famous family clan of the Char who still have a lot of political power in the kind of Caribbean coast. There are apparently associations that Fuad Char had links with paramilitaries and also drug trafficking. Again, they have not been proved. There are just these accusations and rumors that go around. But then from the late 70s and early 80s, when cocaine starts to become a phenomenon, unfortunately, then a lot of the big clubs are affected by it. America de Cali certainly are. The two brothers, Miguel and Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela, are probably putting money in from about 1979, 80, 1981 onwards. One of them is on the board of America at this time. Atlético Nacional will also be probably having drug money coming in. Hernan Botero Moreno is the first. He's a director of Nacional. He is the first Colombian extradited due to money laundering and through drugs. So, he is the director of Nacional at the time. So that's likely to have been happening. Deportivo Independiente Medellin have various drug traffickers on their board or who have been owning Pablo Correa, Ramos, Hector Mesa Gomez, Guillermo Zuluaga, Rodrigo Tamayo. Millonarios, another big club, are first owned by Hermes Tamayo, a drug trafficker. Then they're sold to Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, who is incredibly infamous, right up there with Escobar and the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers. That will probably be happening in the early 80s. Pereira through Octavio Pedreita, Tolima as well, Santa Fe slightly later, probably maybe late 80s, when Fernando Carrillo Vallejo and Fano Zabaleta start to own the club. So this is a process that starts in the mid to late 70s and carries on through the 80s, and a lot of clubs are involved into different extents. So it's not just linked to the big ones, and it really is down to, like I said, institutional fragility, a lack of oversight, a lot of these clubs being financially in difficulties and therefore more susceptible to these kind of amount of funds. And no one is really questioning, unfortunately, too much where this money is coming from.
Another rare success of this early to mid 1980s is America Cali's three straight Copa Libertadores finals that, unfortunately for them, all end in defeats in 1985, 1986, and 1987. How significant was this clear sign of progress?
For Colombian football, incredibly significant. For America de Cali and their fans, of which I'm one, incredibly devastating. Again, I hadn't moved to Colombia by then. Well, I didn't move there till '89, but that was the team I ended up supporting due to living in Cali. But again, you're judged on your successes in South American football, and hierarchy is incredibly important. You'll always hear players, coaches, teams, national teams being talked about their hierarchy, their hierarchy. And Colombia is very low in this hierarchy. Colombia is like Bolivia, it's like Ecuador, it's like Venezuela. It hasn't achieved anything. It's not won anything. Its most famous result is a 4-4 draw against the Soviet Union or the occasional win against Uruguay. It hasn't beaten Argentina, it hasn't beaten Brazil. None of their clubs have won the Libertadores. They've got to a final once. So this is a really big deal. This generation of America is the team that finally defeated the Garabato curse. So there has been a curse from an old kind of player and staff, kind of a fan or a staff member called Garabato, who was angry at several things. He was kind of pushed out of the club. He was angry about the club going professional back in the 1940s. And he apparently cursed the team that they would never win the league. So for a long, long time, America don't win the league. This goes on for a long time until 1979, when Gabriel Ochoa Uribe, the coach of Millonarios in the 70s, is then appointed to America. And the club reconcile with Garabato. There is a mass to lift the curse. So that suddenly, apparently, is bringing success back to America de Cali. And then another thing that really helps them is that there is a lot of money coming in from the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers from the Cali cartel, because suddenly they start buying proper top quality South American football talent. This has not really happened in Colombia since the 1940s and 1950s. So they are suddenly buying players like Juan Manuel Bataglia, a brilliant Paraguayan attacking midfielder, Cesar Cueto and Guillermo La Rosa, some of the Peruvian World Cup players, Julio Cesar Falcioni, a fantastic Argentinian goalkeeper, Jorge Ramon Cáceres, Oscar Mas, Aurelio Pascutini, Ricardo Gareca. Gareca was the manager of Peru in the 2018 World Cup, 2022 World Cup. Long blonde hair, great striker. These are top quality players in South America at the time, and America de Cali are able to buy them. And eventually, because of this quality, Willington Ortiz has also been signed in 1983. Roberto Cabañas, how can I forget Cabañas? Again, another brilliant Paraguayan. So we have this strength in depth, and a lot of it is foreign talent, but there are some good Colombian players as well, with a very organized manager. They are not a thrilling attacking team. They are more of a very solid, extremely well organized, pragmatic team that can score goals when they have to, but also won't concede. So they kind of have everything they might need, really. And in 1985, they go all the way to the final. They've beaten Millonarios. They've beaten two good Paraguayan teams, Cerro Porteño, Guarani. They then beat Peñarol and El Nacional from Ecuador in the semi-finals and meet Argentinos Juniors. The despair in this final is that they got to the third, well, a deciding third leg. The two games in the home leg, the away leg of the final are both won by each team, and then it goes to penalties. And unfortunately, Anthony de Avila misses the crucial one, so they lose 5-4. So it's a devastation. The next year, they do extremely well again. They beat a couple of Chilean teams. They beat Olimpia from Paraguay, Bolivar, and then unfortunately run into a very good River Plate team in the final, who actually beat them in both legs of the final. The most devastating one for America de Cali is 87. It looks like they are going to win. It looks like they're doing it, and then with 7 seconds left of the game against Peñarol in the kind of the third match, Diego Aguirre scores a goal to break Colombian hearts. It's a tragedy for America. It's an awful. They are very unlucky. Gareca was injured. Cabañas was sent off. So was Ampudilla. And unfortunately, they went defensive. They tried to put on people to hold what they had and failed. Aguirre scores with 7 seconds left, and America fail. But it becomes at least a sign of continental presence. The fact that Colombia has a team that can compete with the very best. We also are seeing the start of Colombian players making an impact themselves on the world stage. It's not just these foreign players. People like De Avila are getting a good reputation, Alex Escobar as well. And also, away from the club game, there is a 1985 under-20 generation that does extremely well in the kind of South American championships for that age group. So things are starting to look up in Colombia, at least at a club level. The only problem is that most of it, or at least a lot of it, has been due to drug money that is coming in order to buy these type of players. But the coach that is at least responsible for this is a Colombian who is extremely highly regarded and is probably up there with Maturana in terms of, the greatest Colombian coaches in the history of the game.
The renaissance of Colombian football occurred during the 1987 Copa America, where Colombia, now managed by Pacho Maturana, reached the semifinals. Can you discuss the significance of this event?
It's seen as being the turning point of Colombian football. It's the awakening. It's the time when the first suggestions of national hierarchy are being achieved. The thing that makes it also significant is the identity and the image. This is where we get the start of the Colombian style, the toque style, the highly organized short passing style. It's also charged with a high degree of Colombianness. And by that, what I mean that the shirt is finely yellow, the shorts are blue, and the socks are red. We have the colors of the national flag. This is the first time this has happened. We were talking about the 70s where they're wearing this kind of orange kit. They also had a blue kit, they had a white kit at one time, so Colombia haven't had this visible identity that associates itself with Colombia. They're almost always copying someone else. The blue kit was supposed to be either the Millonarios kit or kind of similar to the old Brazil kit. The orange Zapote kit was supposed to be like the Netherlands. So it seems quite unusual, isn't it, that a team strip is so changeable that it doesn't have an identity, like the light blue and white of Argentina, or the blue of Uruguay, or now the yellow of Brazil. But Colombia don't have that. They only become yellow, blue, and red in 1987. So that's one thing. The 1985 juniors that did very well in that 1985 tournament are now progressing through to 1987. And we also have this identity in terms of what they look like. So you have Higuita with this kind of long black hair. We have Leonel Alvarez with this kind of long black hair. And in terms of the most famous hair of all, we have Carlos El Pibe Valderrama, arguably the greatest hair in world football history, the kind of famous kind of blonde afro, curly. So this is this generation. In terms of on the pitch, one of the things I think is always interesting is that when Colombian success happens, you have to kind of look who they beat. The club sides that we've talked about before aren't always beating some of the greatest teams to get to a semi-final or a final. Sometimes they are, but they're not often beating Brazil. They're not often beating Argentina. And here's actually the case mostly in that they beat a group of they're in a group with Paraguay and Bolivia. They get through that quite well. Arnoldo Iguaran is the scorer of most of the goals in this particular tournament. He will end up as the leading scorer in the tournament. And then they meet Chile in the semi-final and lose. They lose 2-1. Redin scores their penalty. Again, it's quite a good Chilean team. So Colombia have got to the semi-final they beat Bolivia 2-0 and they beat Paraguay 3-0. That's who they've beaten. So it's not a massive achievement. The real achievement, as it's seen in Colombia anyway, and the thing that maybe has an impact, is that they beat Argentina in a third and fourth place playoff. And remember, this is 1987. So this is the year after Argentina have won the World Cup. So Colombia can now claim to have beaten the world champions. And that's the kind of playground-like taunts, the kind of false pride that often football teams rely on. But what is important, it was achieved in a very good way. We have a team playing very well. Valderrama is really running the game. There is a lot of arguments. Argentina don't care. There is a very, very low public. It's a quite famous game because it gets very foggy in the second half and the cameras all have to go to ground level because you can't see what's going on with the cameras kind of high up. But Colombia do score a great goal from Barabas Gomez in the first half, and then Galeano scores with a lovely through ball from Valderrama in the second. Caniggia scores in the second half for Argentina. But Colombia have beaten the world champions. Valderrama is named as the player of the tournament. He is seen as being this new great playmaker. There is a very famous photo of Maradona and Valderrama in that particular game shaking hands. So this is where Colombia become well known. It's where Colombians look to say, this is where our style began. This is where our identity began. This is where the golden generation began. Results wise, it's not outstanding, if we're being really honest, apart from a third, fourth place playoff win. But they are playing very good football. They're seen as being the team that's playing the best football of the tournament. And that does matter in lots of ways.
Carlos Valderrama, like you said, he became the breakout star of this tournament and was now on the radar of European clubs and would eventually join French club Montpellier the following year. So that in itself was a rarity at the time of a Colombian player joining a top league in Europe.
Really rare. Yeah, it's hardly happened. We've already talked about Ernesto Diaz, played a few games in Belgium, didn't make it. Victor Campas went the same and also failed. Colombian players are not going abroad. Willington Ortiz never did. Maravilla Gamboa went to Mexico. Some Colombian players might go to Peru or Mexico or maybe occasionally, if they're very lucky, Argentina. But there's no tradition of this. So this particular generation of players, Valderrama will go across, Higuita will eventually go across, Andres Escobar will go across briefly. I suppose it's fair to argue that in this time, this particular golden generation of the early golden generation, none of them really succeed. I think one of the funny things about Valderrama's career is that he has very little success in big clubs. Montpellier were a good team. Laurent Blanc is playing there. They do win the French Cup, the Coupe de France, but Valderrama doesn't really succeed. He is playing in a much more fast league, much more physical league. He's not seen as being the fulcrum of that team. So he doesn't really shine. He struggles. There are a few times where the player said when we didn't know what to do, we'd always give it to Valderrama because he would then do something brilliant and hold up the ball and control it and pass it on. But he doesn't really have the success at Montpellier that probably his talent merits. You could argue that the same is true at Real Valladolid. From 1991-92, he goes there. And again, you look at the teams he played for. He starts at Union Magdalena, which is a kind of a second-rate Colombian club. He plays briefly at Millonarios. He doesn't win anything there. Before Montpellier, he's at Deportivo Cali, and this is a generation where Cali are definitely the second team of Cali. America de Cali are much more successful. Deportivo Cali are not winning anything. The only things he wins at club level really are Atletico Junior in 1993 and 95. That's where he gets a little bit of national league success. And then he goes to the Major League Soccer in the US, which he's one of the biggest figures in that league, but he is beyond his best. He's pretty old. The MLS is not a very strong league. Sorry, American listeners, but it's not. So it's a real shame that for such a great player on the international level, he never found the success that his talent merits. Certainly in 1990, Colombia do well, do fine. 1994 is a disaster, as we'll go on to talk about as well. 1998, he's beyond his best. He is a shadow of his former self, but he's there, and Colombia don't get through. So, they never win the Copa America. They get that third in 1987. So it seems in a lot of ways impressive that for such a great player, he had such a unsuccessful career in lots of ways. It almost says more about just how good a player he was to play in a lot of teams that weren't particularly good, or maybe there were problems affecting them that didn't maybe reach the pinnacle. But I think almost everyone will know who Valderrama was, what he did, what he looked like. Certainly, he is still an absolute icon of Colombian football to this day. He has this kind of catchphrase, todo bien, todo bien. It's all cool, which he says ad nauseam. He's always on adverts. He's still a figure. He's still an icon. But yeah, he didn't have a career that was littered with trophies. But I think everyone will remember the passes, the vision, the control. It would come to his foot and it wouldn't come off it. There'd be two or three players around him and he'd still find a way to hold on to it and move it on. So he was a class act without any question at all.
Yeah, he's certainly the most emblematic player of that era.
Oh yeah. Yeah, without question.
So in 1988, Colombia are invited to take part in the Rouse Cup in England, the tournament involving England and Scotland. Was this a direct byproduct of the 1987 Copa America?
I think so, yeah. I think there is acknowledgement of excitement. We have a Europe that's much more aware of players and South American football at this time. So I do remember that Valderrama, Higuita, some of those players were known. I do remember hearing about them when I was a kid. I'd have been about 10 or 11, and this came across. So I think there's quite a lot of excitement, but they were a bit of an unknown as well. We'd heard that they were supposedly an upcoming nation. I kind of wonder if they were a cheaper option for the English FA. Brazil had played the previous year. They're not Argentina, they're not Brazil, but there is something about them that is exciting. And again, in England at the time, there is always this sense of, the South American flair, the South American sparkle, the South American genius, even if it's Colombia, that seems to kind of be pasted on liberally without really knowing too much about them. So I think they bought a lot of mystique. The hair is a lot of things that the British press talk about. Higuita obviously has this reputation for running out of sight of his area, and this of course shocks the very conservative minds of English football at the time. Again, English football at the time is a very dull league. It's a very, very dynamic, punt it, get it to the wingers, cross it, score a goal. It's not a great league of technique. when Colombia come and play against actually a very good Scotland team, they draw 0-0. A lot of very good Scottish players in that generation. And then they draw 1-1 with England as well. There is a lot of admiration for the possession game, the technique, the kind of the short passes and control. England struggled to get the ball for much of that game. When Andres Escobar scores the equalising goal from a header, Colombia goes wild. This is a huge moment. This is Colombia being invited by England, the inventors of the game, the masters of football, in Wembley, one of the great stadiums of football history. This is a huge kudos. This is a really massive moment for Colombia because they feel they've now gained more hierarchy. They're being recognised by Europe. They're being invited to play in this tournament on the bigger stage. So again, for Colombia, this is seen as being a really defining moment. That 1-1 draw again becomes an epic moment, even if it's in a friendly. But the way they play, the way they achieve it, the way that they are reported on by the British press is a sign of progress, it's a sign of success, it's a sign of acceptance, and it's a sign that they are entering these kind of higher echelons of the global game.
The boost from this 1987 Copa America also gave the team the confidence to qualify for the 1990 World Cup.
Absolutely. It's a progression. We're seeing that 85 generation progressing through and through. So, 87, there are lots of players still there. In 88 with the Rouse Cup, it's mostly the same players, a year more experience, playing together all the time. A lot of them are playing in Nacional as well. We have to remember that very few of them, if any, Valderrama aside and briefly Andres Escobar, are playing abroad. So they're still playing together at club level a lot as well. So 1990, again, they have quite a nice group. They just have to get past Ecuador and Paraguay, which they managed just. This is when I did go to Colombia. In 1989, I arrived in Colombia just as the final games of the qualification were being played. And I remember that it was in school, we actually were allowed to watch the Ecuador versus Paraguay game. Colombia weren't playing in it, but it all came down to if Ecuador could beat Paraguay, then Colombia would qualify for the World Cup. Oh, sorry, they wouldn't qualify; they would have to play a playoff. So we were watching Ecuador beat Paraguay, and everyone was going mad in this school. Yeah, we're nearly at the World Cup. This is a massive deal. And I thought this is ridiculous. Why are we watching? Why are they that excited? Because again, being English and not really understanding the history of Colombian football at the time, I didn't really get why they were so excited. I just thought this was excessive. And then we were allowed to watch the game where Colombia beat Israel in the playoff. Palomo Azurriaga scores the goal, and then Colombia will eventually beat Israel in the away game, or they'll win the tie and qualify for the World Cup. And this provokes ridiculous celebration. It's the first World Cup qualifying for 28 years. I remember that fireworks are going off, music is blaring out of all the houses near where we lived. We couldn't sleep all night. People are driving around honking their horns. And it's such a big deal. But again, it's a generation that is moving through, that is gaining confidence. The fans are behind them. The press are really excited about it. There is an identity. It feels Colombian. There is a sense that Colombia is doing well. And again, what's really also important about this is particularly important because Colombia as a country in the global glare and in the national frame is doing very badly. We have the drug problems at their very height with Pablo Escobar and what's going on there. We are having bombings, we are having assassinations, we have a lot of murders. Medellin is known as the murder capital of the world. The various guerrilla organizations are still present. There are massacres going on. So Colombia is at it's probably one of its worst national moments in terms of its country. So it's doubly important for the football team to provide some sense of optimism and some sense of pride on a national stage, but also on a global stage to try and change the reputation of how Colombia was seen at the time.
In this year, 1989, there's also finally Copa Libertadores success with Atlético Nacional winning it, eventually facing the great AC Milan side of Arrigo Sacchi in the Intercontinental Cup. I imagine this with the World Cup must have signaled that Colombian football is back on the world stage and further highlighted the renaissance started with the 1987 Copa America.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the Libertadores Cup win, obviously it's important. It's Colombian team's first one. There's always been this push for the major clubs to try and get there. Nacional are the ones that do it. Eternally annoying America de Cali fans. And one of the most important things about why it's such a Colombian triumph is that it is a Colombian-only team. Every player is Colombian in that Nacional 11. The manager is also Colombian, Francisco Maturana. So that's important. They haven't gone about it in the same way that America de Cali did, with trying to buy their way to the title with lots of foreign players. They have bought a couple of the Colombian players that are playing in this team. Higuita, for example, has played in Millonarios previously. But this is a Colombian team playing Colombian football, highly organized, often very exciting. Again, the problem comes because this is a team that is highly associated with Pablo Escobar. Again, it is not like it's obvious. It's not like everyone kind of knows without saying it. That's the problem. There have been threats to referees. There have been threats to teams. Apparently, there is match fixing going on. It's worth saying that back in 1984, the Justice Minister of Colombia, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, has condemned Colombian football for the drug influence. And he was behind Pablo Escobar actually being thrown out of the Colombian Senate, which is where he'd been elected to. So it is known that Colombian football has drug money in it, but nothing has really been done through fear, through the campaign that Pablo Escobar is waging, and people kind of looking the other way. It's easier to look the other way, unfortunately. So there is always the stain, unfortunately, of this Nacional team of how much did drug influence help this particular run to the Libertadores victory. They beat Danubio, a Uruguayan team, in the semi-finals. They beat them 6-0. One of the referees in that game, Juan Bava, has been on television in Argentina since, saying that they were threatened, that someone turned up at halftime with a suitcase of money. There are various stories about these kind of threats to referees going on. Certainly Colombian referees were being threatened in their own league. Some listeners may know that there was even a referee that was murdered, which led to the suspension of the Football League in that particular year. Unfortunately, there is that tarnish, but in the final anyway, it's a two-leg final. They lost against Olimpia, Paraguayan team, 2-0. They then win the home leg in Bogota. It's interesting again that they're not allowed to play their home game in Medellin. The stadium is not seen fit. Again, I've often wondered if this is also to do with maybe they're trying to avoid some kind of drug threats by hosting in Bogota, but the excuse is that the Medellin stadium is not fit to host this game. Then Nacional win 5-4 in penalties. There are 18 kicks taken in total, so it's one of those that goes on and on to sudden death. Higuita is the star. He saves 4 of the penalties from the Paraguayan team. He also scores his own one. Again, Higuita is one of these players that enjoys a penalty. Actually, going back a little bit to America de Cali briefly, when they lost in 1985, the goalkeeper of the America team, Falcioni, was actually supposed to take the 5th penalty that De Avila actually missed. They changed it right at the end. So things could have been different had a Colombian team had their faith in their goalkeeper scoring a goal back in 85. But anyway, Higuita is really the figure. The game in Tokyo against AC Milan, again, has a high degree of Colombianness. This is the great Arrigo Sacchi AC Milan team. All of the stars, Baresi, Maldini, and so on and so forth, a team of the ages. So the fact that Milan only win with a very late goal from Alberigo Evani, 1-0, is seen as being a fantastic result. It's a confirmation that this is a team that is of a top quality status in world football. And again, like I say, these are 11 Colombian footballers doing it, and a Colombian manager as well. So the nation can celebrate it as being a Colombian success. It's not just a national success. Even the most begrudging fans in different parts of the country will at least accept that at least Colombia is doing well with Colombian players.
And speaking of Rene Higuita, in this pre-1990 World Cup period, there's a lot of buzz about him, about being a sweeper keeper, and there are features on him on international magazines. What can you say about his status at this point?
He is El Loco. He is the crazy one. He kind of fulfills this idea, this very kind of, it's a kind of, it's a northern, global north stereotype of South Americans being mad, crazy, passionate, brilliant, but erratic, which is problematic in lots of ways. It's tied into certain moral hierarchies and ideas of people being brilliant rather than hardworking. But he is an incredible talent. He had been a forward before eventually going in goal. And yes, he becomes this sweeper keeper who is absolutely essential to the way that Colombia and Nacional play, and that Colombia can play a high line, and if balls are played through, then Higuita will be coming out and getting the ball, dribbling probably past a forward or two, and then passing it on. He's very good with his feet. Again, the kind of essential item for goalkeepers in the modern era. He will play the ball out, he will dribble the ball out, he will take free kicks, he will take penalties. I think he scored 3 goals internationally for Colombia. He scored something like 40 odd goals in his career as well. So he is not just a gimmick. And he's not just a joke. He is very good at what he does. He is very successful and essential for the way Colombian Nacional play. Personally, as a goalkeeper, I think he was not a great goalkeeper as a goal saver. I always thought he was slightly weak, kind of to his right hand side personally, but he was very good at big teams. You know, he saved the penalties in that 1989 game. He has a certain confidence and a flair and a belief about him that infuses into the rest of the team as well. He provides a lot of security, even if everyone else is, who's watching, and particularly British fans think, "What the hell are you doing? Get back in your goal, you idiot!" But he defines an era. He's almost a pioneer. There are other goalkeepers that kind of had disability, but he does it a lot more with a lot more confidence, with a lot more brio, with a lot more style, arguably. Again, he's got the long hair, which again is part of this image and an iconicity. And again, he comes from poor stock. The only problem he has really is that, apart from the odd clanger, which, happens, is that, he does unfortunately have these other links with Pablo Escobar, which will come to light later on. But at the time, he is certainly seen as being an original. I think that he doesn't get enough credit, or he didn't get enough credit at the time for just how important he was. And bearing in mind what football is now and what goalkeepers have to do now, Higuita was doing in the 1990s. So he was ahead of his time in lots of ways, if not possibly the best ever pure goalkeeper in terms of stopping the ball going in the net. He was good, but I wouldn't say he was in the very top category of South American goalkeepers, like a Chilavert, for example. For my personal opinion, I'll probably get a lot of flack from Colombians about that. But that's how I saw it anyway.
We come to the 1990 World Cup. The memorable moment is that build up to Rincon's goal against West Germany, where Colombia just squeaks by and reaches the second round. And then in the second round, there's that mistake by Higuita, which was inevitable, as, like you said, the odd clanger. But obviously, this was in front of a global stage. But I think at that point, participation was the main victory as far as Colombia was concerned.
Yeah, no, it certainly was. Again, 28 years with no appearances. Getting through a tough group. You're playing West Germany, you're playing Yugoslavia, and a lesser team in the United Arab Emirates. So just getting to the second round is an achievement. I think Colombians will always be very disappointed that they were one of the teams that were Millard, Roger Millard, in that second round game. A lot of people actually don't blame Higuita for that. Actually, in Colombia, they blame, I think it's Luis Carlos Pereira, because I think Higuita comes out, he passes it to Pereira, and then Pereira passes it back to him in a very dangerous area, kind of taking away the momentum, allowing Miller to kind of cut off his passing areas. So actually, Pereira is the one I think that gets blamed for the mistake as much as Higuita does, although it's awful. And again, there's almost a sense of, I think there was quite a lot of satisfaction. It's like, yeah, you did those things. You thought you were cocky. You thought you were arrogant. You thought you were good. And now look what you've done. There was almost that kind of condemnation. I remember the British commentator on the TV seeming to almost sound quite happy when Higuita made that mistake, given that British kind of pragmatism and safety first type of attitude. But the goal that you correctly mentioned by Freddie Rincon is the main takeaway from the tournament. It's such a huge moment. It's such a great goal. The build up from the kind of right back position through Valderrama a couple of times, the brilliant through ball that he plays. The Germans are completely opened up like a kind of tin of sardines. Rincon's through on goal, and not only does he score, but he sticks it through Bodo Illner's legs as a nutmeg goal as well. So it's even better. It's right at the end of the game. It guarantees their qualification to the next round. And everything about that goal has become iconic. Again, it's probably one of Colombia's most famous ever footballing moments. The irony is, of course, that it's a draw. It's a 1-1. It's not a win. Again, Colombia has got a great footballing memory for a game they haven't won, like the 4-4 back in 1962. Colombia, it's funny how few great memories are about wins. But again, it's against West Germany. This is a football powerhouse, former World Cup winners. Obviously, they would go on to win this one. So again, that gives Colombia hierarchy. It gives Colombia status. It's another proof that we can be on this level, that we deserve to be there, that we're a growing football nation, that people should respect us. And again, that team gets a lot of praise, rightly so. They play some good football. That game against Germany was a very even game in lots of ways. The draw was probably a fair result. So yeah, and I think again when Rincon, the goal celebration, the kind of the pumping fists became an iconic image as well. And again, when Freddie Rincon sadly died a couple of years ago, there was a lot of repeating of that goal, a lot of talk about that image. And again, I think Freddie Rincon often gets forgotten in that great generation. He was a brilliant attacking midfielder. He was the energy, this kind of long-legged, powerful. He was known as the Colossus of Buenaventura. He was a very dynamic, goal-scoring midfielder who really complemented Valderrama very well. And Valderrama was picking the passes and being the kind of the fulcrum. Rincon is the dynamic player there. And then you have the kind of defensive midfielders behind them again, and eventually some quite energetic, direct forwards. So Rincon is incredibly important, and that goal is the pinnacle, and probably one of the most important national memories of Colombia at the time.
After this World Cup and ahead of the next World Cup, there's the discovery of a certain Faustino Asprilla, who is part of Colombia's squad in the 1992 Barcelona Olympics. He gets transferred to Italian side Parma, very much under the radar. But within a year, let's say around 1993 going to 1994, he was considered one of the greatest stars in world football. Can you paint a picture of this phenomenon?
Yeah, so I think Asprilla, he's a genius. He's a maverick. He's exciting. He's leggy. He's stylish. He's unpredictable. Again, in lots of ways, he corresponds to a lot of a kind of the westernized idea of what South American footballers are, of genius, of brilliance, of unreliability, but excitement. And I think that in an era where Maradona is kind of past his peak in lots of ways, in an era where there is increasingly pragmatic football. If we remember the 1994 World Cup, for example, it's a World Cup of pragmatism rather than excitement, I think is fair to say, although there are some exciting players. So Asprilla stands out as having that flair. In Colombia, actually, we had seen him. I was living in Colombia at the time, and he was breaking out. You could see it. That particular side that qualified for the Barcelona Olympics, he wasn't the only one. Actually, in lots of ways, people thought that a guy called Ivan René Valenciano would actually be the breakout star. Valenciano, again, he scores this goal from, I can't remember, it was probably about 45 meters against Paraguay in the qualification for the Olympic tournament. It's a brilliant long range goal, spectacular vision. And Valenciano was the poacher. He was a goal machine. He's, again, one of the leading scorers in Colombian league history. He also went to Italy. He went to Atalanta. So actually, you have two players. You have Valenciano and you have Asprilla. And a lot of people thought that Valenciano would be the one that would succeed because he was the goal getter. Asprilla was more mercurial, was more of a maverick, but went to probably a better team. That Parma team is a brilliant team. You have eventually Cannavaro, Thuram. It's an amazing team. Buffon is obviously there as well. So, Brolin, when he was at his peak, is playing in Parma.
Zola, yeah.
Zola, it's
Yeah.
a fantastic. I mean, I had a Parma shirt. I kind of, I was obviously following Asprilla and, and seeing all these other great teams. So I remember buying a Parma shirt back in the day. And again, that 92 generation is a kind of a follow-up generation of great young players from Colombia. You have Victor Aristizabal, Lozano is there as well. A lot of players, Bermudez, who has a great career in Argentina for Boca Juniors. So this generation comes along to supplement the generation that's gone before with Valderrama, with Rincon, with Andres Escobar, with those kind of players. Asprilla, again, he's just this magic. He is so leggy. He's so visible. The goals he scores are spectacular. The way he celebrates is spectacular. The kind of the cartwheel somersault and then the kind of punched fist. So, at Parma and with all the things that they end up winning in Italy and then in Europe as well, he becomes this figure. And unfortunately, some of it probably goes to his head. He enjoys the nightlife. He enjoys a drink. He enjoys going out. But there is something so maverickly exciting about him that it's not really surprising in quite a pragmatic era that he will stand out so well and be a joint figure of why Colombia is expected to be a threat at the 1994 World Cup because Valderrama is there, because a solid defence is there. They think actually Colombia now has the goal scorers. Maybe in 1990 they didn't. Arnoldo Iguaran was probably a little bit past his peak for that tournament, but with Asprilla, with El Tren Valencia, who will be playing in Bayern Munich as well, there is the first signs that Colombian footballers can succeed in Europe. And Asprilla, that's what he certainly does. He is, arguably the first Colombian who says, I am now a European star and a global star successfully and achieving what I'm supposed to do, which arguably Valderrama never really did, for example, when he played in Europe.
We come to the 1994 World Cup qualifiers, and there's that epic 5-0 win at Buenos Aires against Argentina, September 1993. That has been discussed on podcasts, books have been written about it. In fact, you've been on podcast discussing this match.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So it's a match that will live in the collective memory, not only for Colombian football, but Colombian history for its impact and significance. And this was a reflection of the famous playing style of Toque that you mentioned. This moment is like the zenith of Colombian football up to that point. We could spend a whole podcast just discussing about this one match. What is the takeaway as far as its historical significance and how, in one instant, it made Colombia, in a way, a favorite for the World Cup?
Yeah, I mean, it is everything you say, Sean. It is the zenith of football at the time. We've talked briefly about Colombia's great inverted commas wins having just been draws. This is the win. And we've also said that Colombia never beat Argentina. They never beat Brazil when they're doing okay in international football, either at club or national level. So this is what they do. It's a game that matters because they have to qualify for the World Cup and they win it. They do it in the Monumental in Argentina in front of a full crowd. Maradona has said before the game, and again, he's talked about hierarchy. We have to know about history. Argentina are up here, kind of raising his hand. Colombia are down there, kind of lowering it. So we have the Maradona insult. We have this idea that the Argentina is Colombia's footballing father, in that they taught Colombia to play in the El Dorado. Most of the best players in that league were Argentinian. Argentinian players taught Colombians how to play football. There is this arrogance of Argentina. So Colombia absolutely annihilate them, mostly in the second half. Actually, Argentina start the game better, but the longer the game goes on, the more and more Colombia dominate. And they're doing it in this toque style, this passing style, which Argentina actually see as being like their football. There is one journalist who said, they beat us playing lo nuestro, our game, with this toque. So again, often some of these times where style is talked about, it's quite often invented or imagined, and somehow it becomes Colombian or Argentinian. Colombia are playing short passing football. They're revolving around their Valderrama. They're playing it into Valderrama, who will move it slightly off to one of the other players, and then they'll go again. They'll pass again. And then suddenly there'll be a hole. And then you get the pace of Asprilla and you get the pace of El Tren Valencia bursting or Rincon bursting through. And that's how it works. But it is a style, and it's being narrated by the press, by the foreign press, as being this successful type of football of possession and then lightning attacks that emanate through it with dangerous forwards that score goals. And because this win is a 5-0, because it's in Argentina, because it makes a fool of Maradona, because the world sits up and takes notice, because Pelé there says in his great predicting way that Colombia are now the favourites of the World Cup, this is the rubber stamp of hierarchy. We've talked about hierarchy a lot. This is the moment. And the goals that do it have become legendary as the goal we were talking about with Freddie Rincon, particularly the fourth goal where Asprilla steals the ball from a particularly incompetent Argentine defender who makes no attempt to go back. He runs down the left wing and then curls this beautiful shot into the top corner past the goalkeeper. And it's the commentary as well. We have the commentator saying, this is Colombia. Colombia's in the World Cup. This is huge. And then says, the president, every mayors of the town, if you deem it convenient, we need to celebrate this. We have to have a holiday to celebrate this. And the other thing, again, that makes this important, it's not just a football level, but again, to emphasize the fact that Colombia is in a very bad moment. Nationally, we have the FARC, we have paramilitaries, We have cartels, we have a lot of violence, we have a lot of murders still. Whenever I'm lecturing about this, and something I've talked about before, but I always like mentioning it. There's a magazine, Semana, which is the kind of the equivalent of Time, if you like, for American listeners. And on the front cover, the magazine after the 5-0 win, there is a photo of the players all hugging on the ground, like surrounded, all hugging each other. And it says, "Thank you, guys. You, with qualification for the World Cup, you have cast a ray of light through the darkness." That's what it meant. It's a moment of light in a nation that was feeling oppressed, that was feeling shame, that was feeling a lot of fear, that was had a lot of internal violence, and that's emphasized by the top line of the magazine, which says Black September for the FARC, because the FARC have been carrying out these attacks as well. So it's hugely significant. It brings pride, it brings happiness, it brings joy. It's achieved in a Colombian style. The only problem, sadly, is that in the celebrations afterwards, a lot of people die due to traffic accidents, due to shootings as the celebrations are going on. So even that fantastic victory is tinged with some tragic moments. The president actually says, "This victory has shown what our country can do." I'm kind of paraphrasing. He says, "This is the site of a new future." It's hyperbolized. It's magnified beyond really what it should be. But Colombia is so desperate for it to be important. And it is such a memorable moment that it becomes this moment that Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the Nobel Prize winning author, says, it's one of Colombia's three greatest moments of the 20th century. And it still is. Everyone knows it. Everyone knows what happened. Everyone knows the date in Colombia. Everyone could tell you how the goals were scored. It's colossal. It's a massive moment.
Despite the euphoria of qualification and, like you said, earning the favorites tag from Pele and others, there are continuous headlines on narco dollars. There's the imprisonment of Rene Higuita for acting as a go-between in a kidnapping negotiation. So, was it in a way self-evident that trouble lay ahead?
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, Higuita, for example, is not playing in the 5-0. It's actually Oscar Cordoba, who will also be in goal for the World Cup as well. It's known. There is actually Sports Illustrated. I think the journalist is Price does quite a long article about the shadow of shame that surrounds the Colombian team before the World Cup. So it's being exposed internationally that there are links with the cartels, that there is drug money, that some of the players are maybe not friends with, but do know some of these drug barons. Again, Higuita was seen visiting Pablo Escobar in jail, when he was jailed in La Catedral, which is not a good look. There are lots of stories about how other players from Nacional, from Medellin, and some of the other teams had been to the Catedral to play football while Escobar was in jail. Various books have come out since talking about the links between players and cartels and the money that's available. So and again, there's a very good documentary called The Two Escobars, which really deals with this. It deals with the very close links and imaginaries that are going on between Andres Escobar, the footballer, who, as we all sadly know, was murdered after the 1994 World Cup, and Pablo Escobar, the drug cartel. Again, no links, no relation at all. But there are lots of tie-ins, and eventually this is going to collapse. This is going to be exposed. Something's going to happen, and sadly, trouble was going to lay ahead, and it really, it happened with and after, in the World Cup itself, after the World Cup, and then with the kind of the closer investigations into drug football, slightly at home, slightly in Colombia, but certainly in America as well, with the Clinton list, that Colombian football needed to be cleaned. So yeah, trouble certainly lay ahead, and Aguita's kind of involvement with that kidnapping case. And it's the fact that he took money for being a mediator. He took something like $64,000 for mediating for the release of the daughter of, I think Carlos Molina was a drug baron. That's what he got arrested for. But again, he had links with Pablo Escobar anyway, as probably some of the other players did, as the clubs did. And yeah, it was going to collapse at some point. It was kind of, I think, one of Pablo Escobar's assassins, Popeye, who died since. In the video, in the film, The Two Escobars, he talks about this drug influence, and he says that the drug cartel influence on football was like gonorrhea. It was damaging, and it was never going to get out. They're the kind of words he uses in his particularly uncultured way. But it was very prevalent, and yeah, it was all going to fall apart at some point.
And of course, we all know what happened at the World Cup and following the World Cup. What was the immediate ramifications of that?
So I think national despair, national sadness, obviously, firstly for the results, but then magnified even more so when Andres Escobar was murdered in that kind of nightclub out in Medellin a week after the tournament ended. The fact that they lost to the United States of America was seen as a disaster. There was a lot of resentment towards the USA for the US drug policy towards Colombia. The fact that, as is still occurring, the USA is the main market for drugs of all the different types of cocaine at this time. But most of the punishment is going towards Colombia. It's not going towards American citizens for buying the drugs in the first place. So there is a lot of resentment. So when the USA, who are seen as being a joke nation without any history in football terms by Colombians, when the USA win, it's like going from where we could be the best in the world to suddenly we are the worst team. How could this happen to us? The team fragments in lots of ways. That kind of aura is lost. 1998, they do qualify for, but it's a shadow of the team it was. So you have this period of national introspection and sadness and tragedy, and suddenly all of the traumas that football was kind of hiding, football becomes a part of that national failure. So it's a very difficult time. Their reputation on the international stage also kind of falls apart. This was the team that was supposed to do well. They were seen as a failure. They were seen as letting themselves down. But again, I think what comes out in later years of what actually happened explains it. These players were being threatened. There had been on their TV screens in their hotel rooms threats to Maturan and some of the players and the coaching staff if Gabriel Barabas Gomez was going to play. There were worries about their families at home. When they come out onto the pitch, they look scared. They can't. It's impossible to concentrate on football when these kind of things are going on. Yes, there were problems in the run up to the tournament. Yes, they'd got complacent. Yes, they'd been trying to make money through the goal celebrations and sponsorships. But so many things went wrong, and the players weren't always to blame for that. And I don't think they can be blamed for their heads not being on the game when the things went on what they should. Romania was a disaster, but Hadji and Radicioiu were fantastic in that game. It's the great disappointment, it's the great tragedy, and it leaves a void and it leads to a lot of national introspection. In lots of ways, it does mean there is a lot more questioning of the clubs, of the institutions, of the federation. The Clinton list will start to come in that will start to punish, particularly America de Cali, for the drug money links of the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers. But Envigado, another team that suffers a lot through this pressure being put on the money laundering that's going in. So it's a football disaster. It's really the end of the golden generation, and it leaves a void, and it's a national tragedy as well.
So, in a way, it was a bookend and reference point of source for Colombian football.
Yeah, I think it is. It's certainly the end of a great period, which starts for the full national team in '87. But if in lots of ways we could see in 1985 being a starting point in terms of America de Cali and the junior team that does well. So it feels like a bit of an ending point. And really, it's not until kind of 2014, where things are taken back up again. 1998 is they qualify, but it's a nothing tournament for Colombia. It doesn't have any significance really. So that is being seen as an end point for the first Colombian golden generation.
Is this Valderrama Maturana generation responsible for kickstarting and paving the way for future Colombian footballers into today?
I think in lots of ways, yes. They are the first reference points. They are the first global stars. They are the proof that it was possible. They are the links to a certain style and identity that Colombian football can find success in. Directed and coached by Maturana, articulated by Maturana as a national style, obviously supported and represented by the media as well in the way that they produced texts about what this particular Colombian generation was. But it did provide memories, it did provide importance, it did provide hierarchy at the time. And those are things that you can build on. So I think that then you start to see, as these Colombian footballs like Asprilla and like some other players that start to emerge after that, we're thinking about people like Juan Pablo Angel, for example, Hugo Rodallega, these players that weren't absolutely top class stars, but have a pathway now to become players that concede in Europe and believe they can succeed in Europe, and also believe that they can start competing with some of the other South American countries as well. Ivan Ramiro Cordova is another one that I think is incredibly important and doesn't get enough credit for how important he was. But so I think that golden generation is a reference point. It is an example, and even if possibly the 2014 generation might have been very young at the time of 1994, 1990, if some of them were even alive at the time, they would have been, young kids. At least that was in their consciousness. That would have been something they knew, remembered, and certainly the players would be in the public eye, be famous, and be respected for that. So it is certainly a very important example and a very important influence of what could be achieved.
In closing, ending on a positive note, what is the legacy of Colombian football brilliance of the 80s and 90s?
Well, I think it's the identity, it's the style, it's the making Colombian football Colombian. It's establishing memories, it's establishing icons, it's establishing pathways, it's proving that Colombia can compete, that can be successful. All of these things are, of transcendental importance in achieving status, both on a club level, but a playing level and a national level, and also important for national pride. And it cements a connection between, national identity and how it can be manipulated in political ways and how football can be part of that. Certainly, in my book, I talk about how, President Santos in particular will then build on this kind of new generation and build on the narratives that have been created in the past and build on the memories of the past to say that football can bring the Colombia together. It can be something that provides happiness. It can be something that will break down barriers in a very polarized country. It is the source of happiness when other things may be going against us. And I think that for Colombia is sadly a country that has a lot of bad press. When everyone thinks about it, they probably think about Escobar or drugs or violence. And this isn't how Colombia wants to be seen. It's not how Colombians want to be seen. And it's important to know that this is not how Colombia all is. Colombia is a beautiful, diverse, fantastic country of incredible, welcoming, generous, kind, supportive people. So I think that football generation provided happiness, memories, pride in a period where the country really needed it and said there is something different. And I think that is why this particular team was so important in so many ways. And it's still why Valderrama, for example, is still an icon who everyone in the world will know, let alone Colombia will know. And that says a great deal, I think. So I think that's why it's important. Even though if there were all the drug problems still going on, it did so that there was something more. That Colombia was not just all bad, wasn't all violence. There was joy, there was music, there was dancing, there was celebration, there was the chance for people to come together and enjoy things, and that was really important.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. All our contact information and the link to Dr. Watson's book are listed on the blog and podcast listings. So, Peter, thank you once again and hope to continue these discussions on football history.
My pleasure, Shan. Again, thanks very much for the opportunity. Hope that was interesting for the listeners, and yeah, thanks very much for all the interesting questions and delving into this glorious football past.
Thank you.